So we start with the second session, and the big question is, should European Buddhism be engaged? Should European Buddhism, if any, be engaged? So this is a question that deals with issues which are which strongly influence the sense of identity of many European Buddhists, especially younger generations. So key topics here include gender equality, racism, discrimination, the climate crisis, animal rights, bioethics, and so on. So to what extent should European Buddhists engage in these social and ecological struggles as part of their Buddhist practice? And how might they do so in ways that are both socially meaningful and true to their spiritual foundations? Or perhaps, should these struggles lie outside the scope of Buddhism to avoid the risk of political instrumentalization or shifting away from its core spiritual dimension?
So we are talking about engaged Buddhism. And what happened last night, maybe some of you know, is that there was an informal youth gathering. So we gathered the Buddhist youth and also other young people from all over Europe and beyond, who some of them lead Buddhist youth groups themselves, and others are just interested in Buddhism. So yes, we had this youth gathering and we talked about these topics that we are also addressing now, including engaged Buddhism. And first of all, I have to say that young people coming together to talk about the future is not possible at the moment without the help of the older generations. And this is made really visible because yesterday night we used the Buddhist Center that belongs to the Austrian Buddhist Youth, and we could use it for free. And the food was kindly sponsored by the EBU, which was also really nice for us. So if you want young people to engage, we really need older generations to walk the talk. And I think it's being done, at least in the context of the Austrian Buddhist Youth and the EBU, is done very well, because we can meet and we can talk about the future and where we want to see Buddhism in 50 years. And I don't know if you know, when you watch the Oscars or Academy Awards, award shows, and the person goes on stage and then they just rip their speech and then throw it away and start talking authentically. This is what happened to me last night, because I prepared something for today, but the conversations we had were so alive, and I really want to share that with you rather than just my own perspective. And the question we asked in the group was, can a young Buddhist take a stance in the social and political future of Europe? And my stance is very clear, because otherwise I would not create something as the European Buddhist Youth Network, which is all about bringing Buddhism and human rights together. So I am already biased, because my activism has always been informed by Buddhism. When I was 13 years old, I became a vegetarian. I went to the streets of Vienna by myself with a sheet of paper and like a table, and I asked people to sign against holding pigs in like these boxes. Massenschweinehaltung is a very German word. So I went out there and I wanted people to sign, because Buddhism informed this compassion towards animals, and I've been a vegetarian ever since. And the same with becoming a human rights trainer. It is like Buddhism was there first, and every activism that came afterwards was inspired by it. So this is why I am very interested in bringing these two worlds together, human rights and Buddhism. But I was surprised to see that not everybody in the youth group agrees with that. And I would really like to also bring that perspective. So when we talk about politics, we often talk about identity. And one argument that has been brought is, how can a religion that has the aim to free ourselves from our identity take a stance in identity politics? So there was already some paradox that we started to think about. And of course, we didn't find any answers, but I'm sharing with you just the process and the way we approach these big questions. The next argument was that that when we talk about engaging in political debates, we are entering already very polarized spaces. And what Buddhism can do, we argued, is to try to transcend these polarizations by advocating for oneness, by using these Buddhist core values such as compassion and kindness and mindfulness to inform our actions, not only when we talk about politics, but in everyday life. So, so these ideas came to the table of how we can start engaging with topics such as social justice. But another layer that came on top is this idea that Buddhism is an individual practice. So again, we stumbled into a dead end or somehow into a paradox. Because if this is an individual practice that is all about enlightenment and you cannot enlighten someone else, you can only enlighten yourself, how can we step into a political arena and try to change others? So again, a question that arose without really an answer. And maybe the final argument or conclusion to which we came is that if we want to place Buddhism into a political landscape, we would offer a beacon of hope. I'm quoting this. These are not my words. I'm quoting, this credit goes out to the people who came yesterday. So Buddhism offers a perspective that is very often forgotten in these political spaces, right? So the middle way is a way out of polarization, and as well as the way of nonviolence. And what is interesting, because I work in these activist spaces, is that the narrative is very often we need to fight for peace, which again doesn't work. We cannot fight for peace, but it's what most activists say. And here is where Buddhism comes in and can teach us something about the culture of nonviolence. And we are so used to it. We are so used to violence because we grow up in a culture of violence that this is a fresh perspective that Buddhism can bring. And I think we should use this positive stereotype that we have around Buddhism, that we are a peaceful religion and we are very peaceful people. So I think we can instrumentalize that a little bit. But in the end, we thought that Buddhism would really have to bend and stretch in order to fit into this political mold. And we suggested that maybe politics or political discourses need to change in order to enable political participation of Buddhist youth or Buddhists. So yes, we don't want Buddhism. We don't want engagement to be grounded in Buddhist principles just to become another secular activism. But we really emphasize the need for doing the internal spiritual transformation alongside the actions that we do on the outside.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Now, Gabor, the floor is yours.
The college I represent here, the Dharma Gate Buddhist College in Budapest, was founded by 3 different individuals in 1991. One of them is a modernist, a former mathematician and an engineering type of person. The second one is an anarchist, a progressive, but more anarchist type of thinker, and very artistic and very, very hippie. And the third one is a traditionalist, is a very, very conservative, but also traditionalist in the sense of following all the major mystical traditions in various religious contexts. So if you can imagine these 3 people come together and establish a Buddhist college, all considering themselves real Buddhists, what would come out of that? You would say massive debates, no direction, constant fights, and the opposite. The actual outcome was the opposite: constant dialogue, a clear direction, mutual constraints, and a beautiful story. Not without debates, not without issues, not without challenges, of course. So when several years ago they asked me to head the college, my question was, okay, how shall I be? Shall I be a modernist? Shall I be an anarchist progressive? Shall I be a traditionalist? I see all of that, and I see the meaning behind all that. So when I was preparing my answer to this question, should European Buddhism be engaged, I was trying to understand these three different perspectives that they had and try to create some kind of the fourth one that is an amalgamation of the previous three. Now you understand my previous talk was about the same thing, and I try to apply the same methodology here. That's my type. That's my style of thinking. Should European Buddhism be engaged? The answer is, of course, yes. No question. But how? So a modernist would say that engaged Buddhism is rational ethics, that it includes secular ethics and rational compassion. It's based on European rationalism as well. It includes mindfulness and activism. It includes scientific and ethical convergence. So tapping into the best of the tradition in the West, Enlightenment tradition. I mean in the European sense, not in the Buddhist sense. But there is a potential blind spot there that I hear from others criticizing the modernist perspective. They say that there is a risk lying in reducing Buddhist practice to Western liberal activism, possibly stripping it of its deeper ontological and metaphysical roots. So just let's keep that in mind, that there is a potential risk there that engaged Buddhist practice might become identified with Western liberal activism, and what happens with other Western political ideologies in that context. The second, the progressive perspective would say that we would need to transform the world through Dharma. That's our mission. That Buddhism would be a vehicle for liberation, not only in the personal and the individual dimension, but also in the social dimension. So we need to address structural violence. We need to address climate breakdown, the inequality at all levels. So to be truly compassionate, we must confront systems of oppression. And they are in this interpretation, the progressive engaged Buddhists are reinterpreting the precepts and they envision an embodied inclusive sangha, a progressive community with the widest possible inclusivity, including all marginalized voices, disabled communities, LGBTQ, all those marginalized voices. There is a little caveat there that I hear from others who criticize this view, that there is a little fear of losing spiritual rigor in favor of activism, that the challenge is integrating depth on the one hand and action on the other without falling into political polarization. So how can we as engaged Buddhists avoid becoming political in the mainstream sense, in the classical sense? Then the traditionalist perspective is that we would need to preserve Dharma from the secular drift, from the secular influence, that Dharma is not political, that Buddhism's primary goal is liberation from samsara, not social reform. Social reform might come as a consequence, as a secondary outcome, not as a primary goal. And the metaphysical grounding matters, that without belief in the basic Buddhist notions like karma, rebirth, or interconnectedness, etc., social justice can become a superficial moralism. And that Buddhism might lose its radical depth if flattened into secular ethics. So these are the various perspectives. And for the traditionalist, it means that we should not use engagement as an instrument, that there is a risk that political ideologies may co-opt the Dharma, that it might be used as a political tool, and that it would dilute its transcendent aim. So these are the main views. And what I try to do now is to somehow combine them, take the best out of them, and try to address the risks and the caveats. And this I identify as a transmodernist perspective, an integrated, reflexive, evolving perspective, which would go beyond binaries. So the question is not about engagement versus detachment. It's a false dichotomy. A transmodern Sangha would see action and contemplation as mutually informing and equally important. So not putting an emphasis on the on one or the other, and that there are multiple forms of engagement, and that activism can be meditative, chanting in protest, walking meditation for climate, digital sanghas for mental health. There are all sorts of authentic modes of Dharma expression considered as activism, not necessarily just simply fighting or protesting. And I would find it very important to include spiritual ecology and interbeing into or engaged Buddhist perspective, drawing from Thich Nhat Hanh, deep ecology. I think climate and justice issues are deeply spiritual in nature and deeply connected and not external. We cannot really dissociate them. And we would need to criticize both modernism and traditionalism in a way, I think. On the one hand, modernism highlights enlightenment as a universal ideology and value. On the other hand, we may consider traditionalism as too rigid, too orthodox. So how about having a view that is pluralistic, that is embodied, that is conversational, dialogical, and circulatory, as I mentioned in my previous talk? Of course, there is a danger to that too, that without some anchoring in tradition, in teachings, in practice, deep practice, this perspective can also become maybe too eclectic in the end or vague in ethical commitment. So we would need to be able to address that while we are working on this form of engaged Buddhism. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabor. So now, Peter, the floor is yours.
I want to pick up a little bit on what's just been said and have a caution about Buddhist engagement regarding the instrumentalization of the Dharma, and just give two instances, one in contemporary Myanmar and the other one in Sri Lanka. In Myanmar, there have been Buddhist monks who have suggested that the genocide of the Rohingya are justified as a threat to the Sangha in Myanmar. And this is something we must strenuously resist. In Sri Lanka, there are Buddhist nationalists who have made the same claim, that the Muslim minority in Sri Lanka should be eliminated to reestablish the sovereignty of Buddhism within Sri Lanka. I think we really need to resist those kinds of things, and that needs to be part of global discourse. And it's a responsibility that we have, because this news, I mean, some years ago, there was a Time magazine front page, The Face of Buddhist Terrorism. Look it up online. And I think we, as Buddhists, really need to resist that and to give a much more nuanced explanation of what's going on, and to contest these monastics who, against everything that the basic principles of Buddhism suggest, that killing for political reasons is justifiable. But if we take the teaching of interdependence seriously, and I think that ontologically where that ends up is relationality is more basic than things related. That everything is, each one of us are only what we mean for others. So given that, there's no possibility of disengaged Buddhism. That's an imaginary thing. Buddhism cannot be disengaged, not if you're undertaking anything like a traditional Buddhist practice. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that the legends about the Buddha's birth are that he had the shared karma of either becoming a political leader or a world religious leader. I think that's worth reflection. I mean, it's just a legend, it's just a story. But what is that story, that legend, asking us to consider? It's asking us to think that if you have the patterns of values, intentions, and embodied actions that could lead you to be becoming either a virtuosic politician or a virtuosic spiritual leader, and it's the same karma that gets you to either of those two conditions, then there's not really an ultimate difference between doing the work of the Dharma and the work of politics. I don't think that there's ultimately a difference between those two. So I think that taking that seriously, we should take account of the fact that, yes, if there's any suffering going on in the world, if we take it as basic Buddhist instruction to see the world as afflicted by conflict, trouble, and suffering, then the suffering of any of us, we are implicated in that suffering. We are implicated in the suffering of any of us. All of us are implicated in the suffering of any of us. That's a mandate to do something about it. So I think that with that in mind, we're in a very strange position historically, because for the first time, humanity is facing the possibility of its own destruction. We are facing the possibility not only of no future humanity, but no future organic life on the planet. We're talking about a sixth mass extinction, where over the next 300 or 400 years, at the best estimate, we're going to lose 75% of the species on the planet if we keep doing the things the way we're doing them. Something needs to change. But I think when you hear people talking about these existential risks, whether it's the risk of bioengineering and a pandemic that's going to be worse than COVID-19, or artificial superintelligence and how it might take over the world, or just the mainstream old-fashioned climate change and what that might do to the planet, the response from many people in the West is survival. We need to ensure human survival. And so they're coming at this from this sort of neo-Darwinian understanding of evolution, in which what matters most for us as human beings, as living beings, is survival. And Buddhism says no, that's not what matters most. Sad to say, we're stuck with survival. Unless we do something about it, we are obliged round after round of life in samsara. Surviving is not the issue. We will survive. It's how we survive. And so it's really coming to a very, very clear understanding of what matters most. And we can't do that alone. So I think part of what the lesson from the Buddha's life history is, and that karma is, has the karma to become a great politician. And what did that mean? If you look at suttas like the Chakravarti Sihananda Sutta, where things go wrong is when a Dharma ruling king doesn't invite others to give their opinion about how to deal with a crisis in society. It's when someone decides autocratically that I'll figure out how to do this on my own. That's when trouble starts to happen. That's when things start to unravel. So I think that in addition to this idea that Buddhism has to be engaged, we have to realize there is no solitary Buddhist practice. It just doesn't really exist. And I'll give you a kind of an example as to why that's the case. We now know from neuroscientific evidence that if people are engaged in an activity together, and that activity is competitive, that their brain waves will not resonate. That is, the infrastructure of our consciousness will not start to map and resonate with one another. If people are engaged in a collaborative activity, then their brain waves will start to resonate with one another. But the important thing is, it's not just that they are engaged in a collaborative activity, they have to believe that they're engaged with another person doing that. The setup of the experimental setup was fascinating, where you were told sometimes you're going to be collaborating with a human being, sometimes you'll be collaborating with an AI. When people believed they were collaborating with another human being, their brain waves resonated with one another. When they believed they were communicating and collaborating with an AI, their brain waves didn't coordinate. They were always collaborating with humans. This tells us that if we consider ourselves to not be collaborating with one another as human beings, whether for political reasons or for other reasons, our basic infrastructure of presence will not resonate together. It gives us an idea of why it is that Dogen, in talking about practice, says, practicing alone is all self. Practicing together is Buddha's. we must practice together, because when we are practicing together with belief in the Dharma, a conviction in those basic values, and we're doing that together, we will resonate with one another, and our whole body, mind, environment complex will come together with the kind of connection that will allow us to actually get things done in the world. We need to transform what matters most, as humanity doesn't just ensure its survival, but takes the real challenge of saying, now we will be responsible for our future evolution. I think that's what's really at stake with engaged Buddhists. Where are we going in evolutionary terms? We went from biological evolution to cultural evolution. We now stand with our extinction in our faces of having to engage in intentional evolution. We can only do that together.
Thank you, Peter. And now Bhikkhuni Dhammadina. Yes.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Rogers. Yeah, so, well, I very much resonate with what's been said so far. And maybe I'll just speak a little bit from the perspective of the early Buddhist teachings, which is my area of academic expertise and also where my own practice is based on. And just I mean, by the way, this is not with the pretense that this is what the Buddha taught, or this is not original Buddhism, or what I like as being original Buddhism. Is just as close as possible an approximation we can get to the earliest formulation of the Buddha's words and of the Buddha's teachings, which is not equal the Buddha's words as such. So just to say, so this is, I'm not trying to claim some form of early Buddhist fundamentalism or anything of the sort. So from that perspective, this matter of engagement is already part of the structure of human experience, in the sense that we do share this togetherness in the world. So we are all constructing experience basically in the same way. So we might construct different contents of experience, but we do all share this very fact that we are constructing our experience in response to inner, outer contact, feeling, tone, embodiment, conceptual recognition, etc. So we all share these constructions of identity, and this is a reality. This is a matter of fact, but we do not share exactly how this is happening. So, like a base for, I think, interconnection comes from this recognition of this universal fact of being subject to the construction of identity and experience. And so the idea of affinity or affinity groups or coming together based on this or that identity is somehow seen through in terms of like a wider, like a deeper, more fundamental sense of sharedness. So the world is already like there at hand. I mean, it's not that I have to connect to the world. We are all constructing the experience of the internal and external world. And there is also a very practical way to access this mode of being in the world, which is the external dimension of mindfulness. So, I mean, all Buddhist traditions, they all share this basic teaching of the four foundations or establishments of mindfulness. And each establishment of mindfulness basically covers one area of subjectivity in the world. And each of them, they have a very modular, repeated structure. So each of them involve a refrain or like a fixed formula, which is about contemplating things internally, externally, internally, and externally. So this external dimension of mindfulness practice with regard to all areas of subjectivity, embodiment, affect, or the hedonic dimension of experience, and mental states or changing mental states, and what do I do with experience, gearing it towards awakening or non-awakening, which is like a very baseline understanding of the four dimensions of mindfulness. They all come with this injunction to see things externally as much as internally. So this goes to show that engagement is already seen as a fact of experience and is also cultivated actively, intentionally by a way of implementing the four establishments of mindfulness with regard to the external dimension of mindfulness. So there isn't much to do about that. I mean, it is just a fact. So as a Buddhist practitioner, I do have the tools to engage with the world, and I also recognize that I am constructing the world in the same way that others are constructing it.
Thank you very much. Stephen.
Thank you. Well, being last rather than first in this round has just a different set of problems. In other words, everyone has said things that I've already got jotted down on my notes. But I'd like to start this reflection by just pausing to ask, why do we have this term engaged Buddhism? Why? I think it suggests quite clearly that at certain points in its history, despite what everyone has said, Buddhism, I think, has become disengaged. To emphasize engagement is an acknowledgement at one level of how Buddhism or Buddhists seem to have withdrawn too much from the world. And I think it also reflects the power differential between the monastics on the one hand and the lay people on the other. And the real practice of the Dharma is generally thought to occur as a monastic. When I was a young Buddhist, I got the message again and again and again, if you really want to practice, you should become a monk, which I did for 10 years. But nonetheless, it does point to the fact that the bias, possibly unconsciously, has moved over the centuries to the focus of Buddhist practice being that which can be best done under the conditions of monastic vinaya, of rules, of frameworks, of monasteries and communities and so on. And the lay community, you don't really know much about the history of the Buddhist lay community at all. There's hardly any textual records of how lay Buddhists lived and ran countries and did business and all these things. There's virtually nothing that we know about that. So to that extent, I think it's true, of course, as you've been saying, that it's not possible to not be engaged. I completely agree with that. But on the other hand, there would not have been a need to come up with the idea of engaged Buddhism had it not been seen as a way of correcting some kind of bias that had crept into the tradition. Now, this, of course, leads to all kinds of other issues, which we can maybe explore later. There's also a problem with the term engagement. It sounds good when you hear engaged Buddhism. People say, well, that sounds really nice. But engagement is a very, very fluid term, as Peter was pointing out. The Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka and in Myanmar, Burma, have been very engaged, but not in ways that we'd approve of. And I think quite rightly, I agree with that. You can go back further and look at the role of Japanese Buddhists in the Second World War. They were training kamikaze pilots, they were writing Buddhist texts justifying militarism. Even D.T. Suzuki, one of the great founders of the Zen movement in the West, wrote a book in 1896 in which he argued that Buddhism and the state had to become one thing, and was very much in favor of Japanese military expansion and so on. In fact, it's people like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh in the 20th century are actually probably more the exceptions than the rule. Buddhist countries defend themselves much the same as any other countries do. And we see this very clearly in the examples that have been shared. So when we say engaged, we're actually not declaring fully what we mean. Engaged would mean engaging with the world informed by a very specific set of values and priorities and ethics and so forth and so on, and philosophy. So it's a dangerous term in a way, I fear. We certainly see examples of how when Buddhism becomes a state religion, which it has done in many countries in Asia, as soon as that happens, it becomes complicit in the violence of the state. And that, I think, is a huge problem. And in Korea, for example, Buddhist monks in Korea have to perform military service. I was very surprised when I arrived in Korea as a Zen monk that halfway through the retreat in the summer one year, I came, instead of finding the monks in the zendo, they were in military fatigues out in the courtyard. They were going off for a day's training. I was absolutely horrified by this. I couldn't believe it. And I asked one of my Korean monk friends, how do you justify taking vows to not kill? These were bhikkhus, and doing military service. And he looked at me very bewildered and said, "You would not be willing to die for your country?" Which is a good question. And I still ponder that. And I also have to recollect that I only have the privilege to practice Buddhism in Britain or in Europe or elsewhere because of the sacrifices previous generations have made to give me the freedoms and the support and the education to do that. And millions of people died in the Second World War in order to ensure that my generation had the right to and the freedom to pursue the kind of lives we have. So it's not so straightforward just to say Buddhism is non-violent. Violence is built into the very structure of the countries, the nations, particularly the nation state of its current form, is intrinsically violent. So if Buddhism is to engage politically, I think it has to be an engagement that transcends the boundaries of the nation state. And here I think Europe becomes a very interesting example. The European Union is a transnational body. In other words, the countries within the Union, and previously Britain, which opted out, effectively surrender certain policy decisions to a body that transcends all of them. And today in France, for example, I live in France, the number of French people I've heard complain about the new system of plastic bottle tops, like these ones we have here, they're attached to the tonne, right? This is for the sake of the whales and other sea creatures. But a lot of French friends of mine complain bitterly about the new bottle top. And part of it is because it's been imposed by Brussels. They didn't have any say in it. Do we want plastic bottle tops that stuck to the bottle? No. Brussels does. I mean, this is it's a minor example, but I think it shows the extent to which national sovereignty is very much embedded in our unconscious. And there is a strong resistance to somehow surrendering some of that sovereignty such that a transnational body such as the EU can do it. And one of the reasons Donald Trump hates the EU is precisely because of that. It means that national governments surrender some of their authority and power. Buddhism, which from the very earliest days has always seen its field of activity as within all sentient beings, I think needs constantly to refer back to that universalist dimension of the Dharma. And engagement, therefore, I feel has to be transnational and not tied to any particular nation state. One way that might help towards that would be to start to think of the Dharma more as a sequence of tasks rather than a sequence of truths. In other words, what we're called upon as practitioners is to embrace suffering, is to fully understand dukkha, the condition of conflict and distress and so forth we find in the world. It's not to somehow take as an ontological position, life is suffering. The second task is to let go of our habitual reactive patterns that spontaneously and conditionally arise on encountering suffering or something we desire or whatever. It's about letting that craving be, letting it go, not getting caught up in its narrative. And then, as we do that, we find ourselves engaged with the contemplative task of actually seeing and contemplating the non-reactive mind, which is called different things in different Buddhist traditions. And that depth provides, I think, the source of how the path, the Eightfold Path, it then emerges and is cultivated. So I would put as the goal of Buddhist practice not nirvana or enlightenment, but rather this sequence of tasks that leads us into the stream of the Eightfold Path, which we cultivate. And one of the great beauties of the Eightfold Path is that it's not focalized or privileging any particular dimension of our humanity. It includes the way we see the world, the way we think about it, the way we speak, the way we work. It's the totality of our human being that is cultivated on this path. And in this regard, I feel we might be able to think of the goal of our practice as something, on one hand, complex, more than just getting a deep insight into ultimate truth. And I'm glad that Dhammatina mentioned how in the early text there is no ultimate truth, relative truth. It's a later introduction. It has some use, I admit, but on the other hand, it sets up a binary that I think is extremely problematic. But I do think what the practice calls for is to find a balance and a harmony between the contemplative life and the active life. This is a distinction that goes back to Aristotle in the West, and I find that an extraordinarily useful way to rethink the Eightfold Path as a model that provides a framework for integrating these two dimensions of our humanity. We find it also in later Buddhism. We find the distinction between upaya kausala, skill in means, and prajna, wisdom. Wisdom being the depth dimension, skill in means being the breadth dimension. And the two really are there to be integrated. So as to the question, should European Buddhism be engaged? Yes, but carefully defining what that engagement means from a Buddhist perspective. And secondly, integrating engagement as a necessary part of our practice. That my practice of speech, for example, should be just as integral to my practice of Dharma as my practice of meditation. Whereas we tend to privilege one over the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But actually, maybe two more questions were listed. So, to what extent should European Buddhists engage in these social struggles as part of their Buddhist practice in a way that it could be socially meaningful and true to their spiritual foundations? That was one topic. Second topic, should these struggles lie, well, actually it's an alternative, outside the scope of Buddhism to avoid the risk of political instrumentalization or shifting away from its core spiritual dimension? So maybe some of these topics have been touched upon.
Well, they have been touched upon. I mean, clearly we mentioned them, but my worry about those sorts of issues is that there's a tendency sometimes to think there should be a Buddhist position on these things. I think that's dangerous. And I don't know quite how we would arrive at it, and I don't quite see what would be served by that exercise. And I guess really what we're trying to do with those examples is really to flesh out what we mean by dukkha, what we mean by suffering in our world today, in our society today. These seem to be very salient examples of people suffering, human beings, gender equality and so forth and so on. So yeah, I don't believe there should be a Buddhist position on any of these things. But I do feel that we need to ask more deeply within ourselves how, if we are to aspire to leading a life of compassion, wisdom, how would we more wisely and compassionately deal with these questions? But it might go beyond the reach of what our Buddhist tradition may be able to help us with too.
I'd like to ask you a question. Do you think Buddhism is inherently apolitical?
Well, no, I don't. And again, that would be to me an empirical question, really. And we saw in the examples that Peter and I raised, Buddhists get very involved in politics. In actual fact, it's like saying, is Buddhism inherently non-violent? In theory, yes. In practice, not at all. Ditto politics. Buddhists like to think of themselves sometimes as above all of those things. But in practice, Buddhists are as political animals like anybody else. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and to live with it and work with it.
And the examples you gave from political engagement were negative. Did I get that right?
Yes, they were deliberately negative, yes.
So are there any examples of positive engagement into politics by
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot. I mean, the formation of the Ming Dynasty would be one, which was a Buddhist terrorist group, basically called the White Lotus Society, that overthrew the Mongol Empire. I think that's a much better example. But again, it's violent again. Yeah, I think a lot of Buddhist activities over the centuries have been very engaged. I mean, think of the Buddhist art, which tends not to get mentioned. I love visiting the ancient Buddhist art of India, China, elsewhere, because you see there the engagement of artisans and artists who are creating these extraordinary statues, temples, whatever it might be, stupas. That's a form of engagement. And I think that's very, very positive. So the arts, creativity, I'd like to see more engagement directed into those avenues of expression, both personal and communal expression, which makes somehow the Dharma visible in a sensorial way. So that would be a positive example, yeah. Or, yeah, Baba Saheb Ambedkar in India, for example, that's a very good example, who was, I'm sure most of you are aware of his work, but he was the justice minister in Nehru's first government after independence in India, who helped write the Indian constitution as a secular constitution, and at the same time converted to Buddhism, and brought with him many of his people who were Dalit, formerly untouchables, and now, long after his death, that movement is still huge in India. So that's a very good example.
So
Thank you, Martin.
if I'm not mistaken, all the examples you brought now are out of Europe. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. I think the point I want to get to, I'm not making it, I'm sorry, but I am not sure if I agree with Buddhism shouldn't have a standing. And I'm actually really inspired by what I heard from Stefano. Whenever the European Commission is looking for a Buddhist voice on certain matters, global matters, such as, for example, Palestine-Israel conflict, they call the EBU and they want a statement. So I do think that statements exist, and I think that these statements are important to make. And I'm asking myself the question, who is Buddhist in Europe? And is it maybe, I don't know, I haven't collected any data on it, or is it maybe people who are in such privileged positions that they don't have to think so much about these things that are mentioned, racism, LGBT, human rights? You know, maybe this is why it feels so like we can lean back and enjoy our privilege, and we can be apolitical and be passive and, I don't know, just meditate. But maybe, I don't know, there are no black people. I don't see any black people in this room. I come from an ethnic minority. I'm Roma. I'm a Roma activist. So for me, there's no option not to be political. And I think as a Buddhist, we also...
Yeah. No, I take that. I accept that. Absolutely.
When I teach engaged Buddhism at the college, I spend maybe 2 or 3 classes just on sensitizing the students. Their primary understanding is that Buddhism is for themselves, for the individual, for the private psychological trauma related matters. Not even enlightenment or reaching nirvana. It's basically how to cope with suffering. And but then when I show the main figures of engaged Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh, Ambedkar, Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, Aryaratne in Sri Lanka, or Sivaraksa in Thailand, and others, they start realizing that they have that in them, that they have that engaged perspective in them. And the notion that helps the most is the notion of interbeing, realizing that we are not individuals. And that's mind-blowing when they realize that the reality is that we are intersubjective, that we are interbeing, that we are relational, we are connected, and that everything that we have as individuals is coming from somewhere else.
What we do know is what's going wrong now. We do know that when people are raised in an environment where they cannot express their full humanity, like a Dalit in India when the caste tradition was still very, very strong, that is a violence against them. And we ought to do our practice in order to help them to be freed from those constraints. If you're a gay person growing up in different parts of the world, you could either be happy and celebrating it or feel like you have to remain in the closet. We shouldn't be forced to adopt any specific kind of identity. But I'd say that my understanding of interdependence is that it's not just a fact about the relationality of all things. Everything is interdependent. That's neither good nor bad. You could have very destructive forms of interdependence. We've got a global capitalist system that leads to very great destruction on the natural environment. Great, it's interdependent, global supply chains, but it's not very helpful for humanity. So I think the struggle is to say, can we differentiate ourselves from one another, whether it's nationally within Europe, or the larger scope of European identity, or globally? Can we distinguish ourselves from one another in a way where our differences become the basis of mutual contribution to sustainably shared flourishing? That is what I think diversity should mean. It's not a numbers game. It's not about how many different sexual identities you can have. It's not about how many different nationalities are present or how many different cultural groups are present. Diversity is a relational index of the degree to which those differences are mobilized, activated as the basis of mutual contribution to shared flourishing. And again, it's not common flourishing, it's shared flourishing, in which each of our differences is respected as the basis of mutual contribution. I don't know about all of you guys, but I don't wake up in the morning and look at myself in the mirror. I shave after I go surfing in the morning without looking in a mirror, just shave in the shower. I don't get up in the morning wanting to have a conversation with myself. I want to talk to my wife, to my son, to my colleagues, my friends. It's our differences that give us vitality in life. We need to celebrate those differences, but with the kicker, if you're practicing Buddhism, it's not just enough to claim your right to differ from others. You also have to actively and effortfully try to differ for others. Differing from others should be a right. Differing for others is our obligation.
May I just couple of minutes? Maybe? Yeah, I mean, we do respect, but Peter, you just said I go surfing first and then, I share. This is privilege, this is like white privilege in action. And I think this is what, this is about, sort of like, for example, with the Ambedkar community. I mean, we all think the mainstream narrative that Gandhi, was the father of nonviolence. Actually, it was Ambedkar who really established that. And Gandhi was adamant that the caste system should be embedded in the Indian constitution. And he got it right in the end because he got it his way and he was, playing on that. So I'm just bringing this in terms of which narrative then becomes established as the mainstream narrative and who is marginalized or excluded just doesn't have a voice there. So it's also a matter of like, how do we make space for other voices? I mean, as Jana was saying, there is no black person in this room. I mean, I saw like a few Taiwanese practitioners somewhere over there from Fo Guangshan, I think. And that's about it. I mean, I don't see Asians around here, etc. So, I mean, it's not personal at all, but I do think that this question of, not having given, and taking this on board, this power structures on board is quite primary. And, if we don't do something about it, this is one power-based version of Buddhism. This is not Buddhism. I mean, even, making statements, how as inclusion or diversity have to be implemented, it's all coming from top down and is not coming from a really inclusive position. So somehow it's kind of itchy for me. I mean, I've lived most of my life in Asia, of my adult life in Asia, and somehow it feels a bit itchy to me, talking about all of this. I cannot express it, rationally, but somehow I do feel it's not 100% authentic for us to be here talking about it. And there is nothing, I'm the first one who's talking about actually, so I'm not the saint at all here, but there is something really wrong, I think, in this whole statement of power and talking for others or on behalf of others, which maybe we really need to look into, or what do we do with non-binary individuals? What do we do with women, with nuns, with lay women who have been supporting monks for their whole life and they don't have a place? These questions are real because these people suffer. So it's like there is no reduction of suffering. So anyway, this is a bit emotional for me, but I do feel it's kind of a big thing in our Buddhist communities.
We can talk about Buddhism nowadays without Ashoka. We can talk about Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, without Sonsen Gampo. It's possible to talk about His Holiness in Tibet now. Italian Buddhist Union is very, very happy to support this event. But how is possible? Due a political decision that is inside the Republican Constitution, Italian Constitution. So we can access to funds. And this is a political decision of our country. So everything is in some way a political decision. So I think we don't have to be involved in political affairs just to defend the Dharma, but just to put on the table a perspective, a vision of the world. And so in some way I don't see, and I think it's a problem, I don't see any kind of real strong engagement. I don't see Buddhist people involved in institution nowadays. So it's a casualty, it's a decision, or because just we have fear, we risk something. This is something very, very important to understand, because nowadays there is a president in US that is justifying his decision because he's in mission for God or something like that, So we see how much we have to take care about our involvement in political decision. Sorry. So I was curious of the reason why your colleagues, your friends, they are a little bit afraid, but probably I misunderstood what you said. Thank you.
I'm very happy you're inspired. I would say all of them would take to the streets as individuals. I'm not sure if they would take to the streets as Buddhists. And this is what you were referring to. So it's not that young people, they are political. We are a very political generation. But I think one of the reasons could be is that we are really sensitized when it comes to cultural appropriation and maybe cultural misappropriation. And I think maybe there's a little bit of fear of taking a spiritual tradition that is not inherited to our country, taking it and in a way wanting to do it right, do it in a right way and in a justified and in a way that keeps the integrity. And I think this is where young people start to think a lot about, okay, what are the fundamental values of Buddhism, and do the fundamental values of Buddhism, is there enough space to also be political at the same time? As I said, we kept ending up in paradoxes, because how do you talk about identity politics if you don't have an identity? So I think there's a little bit of, still we are in the development of creating a European Buddhist identity. And this is a quote as well from yesterday from one of our colleagues, is we are still figuring out who we are as Buddhists in Europe. So I think this step is first. I don't know if I mentioned it today already, but most of the people who come regularly to the Buddhist youth don't call themselves Buddhists, even if they come for years and years. So this needs to be addressed first. And then the second step is to go into the public space, into political spaces as Buddhists and not only as individuals.